Elk Valley. He had dreamed of owning land, building a home, and marrying the young woman who had believed in him before he believed in himself. Life had chosen another trail. Now the autumn wind carried dust instead of hope as Wyatt led his tired bay horse south toward a ranch he had not seen in nearly 13 years. He almost turned back twice. Every mile brought another memory. Every memory reminded him of the promise he had broken. The sun was beginning to sink when the weathered ranch house finally appeared beyond a line of cottonwood trees. The place looked smaller than he remembered. One side of the barn leaned slightly. Several fence posts had collapsed, and the windmill turned with a slow, uneven groan that echoed across the empty pasture. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Someone still lived there. Wyatt climbed down from his horse and carefully lifted Ethan into his arms. "You stay close to me." The little boy wrapped both arms around his father's neck. "I always do." Those 4 simple words nearly broke Wyatt's heart. He walked toward the porch with slow, uncertain steps. Before he could knock, the front door opened. A woman stepped outside carrying a basket of freshly washed clothes. She froze. So did Wyatt. Neither spoke. The years disappeared for one impossible moment. Her name was Abigail Turner. Time had softened the brightness of her chestnut hair, but not the kindness in her green eyes. She wore a faded blue dress beneath a worn brown apron, and loose strands of hair moved gently in the evening breeze. She looked at Wyatt as though she were staring at a ghost she had spent years trying to forget. Then her eyes moved to the little boy. The child hid his face against Wyatt's shoulder. Abigail lowered the basket without realizing she had done so. "Wyatt." His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Hello, Abby." No one had called her Abby in over a decade. She had almost forgotten how it sounded. For several long seconds, the only noise came from the windmill and the horses shifting in the pasture. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most. "What happened to you?" Wyatt looked toward the distant mountains before answering. "Too much." She noticed the fresh dust covering his boots, the patches sewn onto his coat, the tired horse standing behind him. Then she saw something else. His hands. The strong hands she remembered had become rougher, scarred by years of hard work and harder losses. And him. Wyatt looked down. "This is Ethan." The little boy slowly peeked around his father's shoulder. Abigail smiled as gently as she could. "Hello, Ethan." The boy hesitated before giving the smallest wave. She smiled again. Something inside her chest tightened. Children had never filled this house. Her husband had died 4 winters earlier from pneumonia, before they were ever blessed with a family. Since then, silence had become another piece of furniture inside the old ranch house. Wyatt shifted awkwardly. "I shouldn't have come." Abigail looked at him carefully. "But you did." He nodded once. "I've been turned away from every boarding house between Missoula and here." His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "I've found work before. I'll find it again. But Ethan needs a warm place tonight." The little boy leaned sleepily against him. His eyes were already beginning to close. Abigail looked at the child for a long moment. His coat was too thin. One glove was missing. His boots had been repaired so many times, they barely resembled boots anymore. She remembered another young man, once standing in nearly the same place with empty pockets but endless dreams. The memory hurt more than she expected. What about his mother? Wyatt swallowed slowly. "We buried her last winter." The words settled quietly between them. No dramatic tears. No long explanation. Just truth. Abigail lowered her eyes. "I know what that kind of silence feels like." Wyatt looked at her wedding band, no longer resting on her hand. I heard about Daniel. She nodded once. He fought until he couldn't. Neither of them spoke again. Grief needed no introduction. Ethan suddenly looked toward the open doorway, where the warm smell of fresh bread drifted outside. His stomach growled loudly. The child looked embarrassed. Wyatt gently rubbed his back. "It's all right, son." Abigail heard every word. Without thinking, she stepped aside. "You both look frozen." Wyatt immediately shook his head. "We're not asking for charity." "I know." Her answer came quietly. "I'm not offering charity." She pointed toward the crooked windmill beyond the barn. "My well keeps failing." She pointed toward another broken fence stretching across the pasture. "My south pasture won't hold cattle anymore." Finally, she looked directly into Wyatt's eyes. "I need someone who still knows how to save a ranch." Wyatt stared at her. "And if I stay?" "You work." "And Ethan?" "He eats." He blinked. "You'd trust me after everything." Abigail's face became thoughtful. "I don't know if I trust the man who left 13 years ago." She glanced toward the sleepy little boy. "But I trust the father standing here today." The words struck Wyatt harder than any punch ever had. His shoulders dropped as though he had been carrying the weight of the world alone for far too long. Ethan quietly whispered into his father's ear. "Can we stay?" Wyatt closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "If Miss Abigail truly means it." Abigail smiled softly. "I do." She walked inside and held the door open. The warm light from the oil lamp spilled across the porch. For the first time in many months, Ethan smiled. It was small. It was shy. But it changed the feeling of the entire evening. As Wyatt stepped across the doorway, he paused. Years earlier, he had imagined crossing that same threshold as Abigail's husband. Instead, he entered as a tired widower, carrying nothing but his son and memories he wished he could change. Sometimes life returned people by a road no one expected. Inside the cabin, Abigail poured warm stew into 3 bowls while Ethan sat quietly at the table, staring at everything with wide eyes. There were dried flowers hanging near the window. A handmade quilt folded across a rocking chair. An old family Bible rested beside a brass lantern. The house felt lived in. "Safe," Ethan whispered so softly that only Abigail heard him. "It smells like home." She turned away before either of them noticed the tears filling her eyes. If this reunion has touched your heart, stay with the story. Sometimes the longest journeys lead back to the place where hope first began. That night, while rain tapped softly against the cabin roof, none of them knew that a forgotten secret buried 13 years earlier was quietly making its way back to Bitter Elk Valley. And by sunrise, it would change everything they believed about the past. The next morning began before sunrise. A cold mist floated across the pastures while the first rays of light painted the mountains with soft shades of gold. The ranch looked peaceful from a distance, but Abigail Turner knew better. Every broken fence, every empty water barrel, and every patch of dry grass reminded her how close she was to losing everything. She stepped onto the porch carrying a tin cup of coffee. Wyatt Mercer was already working. He had been awake long before dawn. His horse stood beside the old windmill while Wyatt climbed halfway up the wooden tower, studying the worn gears that groaned with every turn. Abigail watched quietly. Some things had changed. Others had not. Even as a young ranch hand, Wyatt had always repaired the hardest job before breakfast. She smiled without meaning to. Perhaps that part of him had never disappeared. Behind her, tiny footsteps crossed the porch. Ethan rubbed his sleepy eyes and wrapped himself in a blanket that nearly reached the ground. "Papa." Wyatt looked down immediately. "I'm right here, buddy." The little boy smiled, satisfied. Abigail noticed something that touched her heart more than she expected. Every few minutes, no matter what he was doing, Wyatt looked toward Ethan. It wasn't fear. It was habit. The habit of a father who had spent too many nights wondering whether his child would still be safe by morning. She poured another cup. "You'll fall off that windmill before you've had breakfast." Wyatt laughed softly for the first time since arriving. "I've climbed worse. You've become more stubborn." "I've had practice." Their eyes met for only a second before both looked away. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt careful, as though neither wished to disturb something fragile that had only just begun to heal. After breakfast, Wyatt inspected the ranch from one end to the other. The southern pasture fence had collapsed after heavy spring floods. Half the chicken coop leaned sideways. The well produced water only when the old pump was forced by hand. He removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "You've been fighting this place alone." Abigail folded her arms. "I've managed." "You survived." She looked at him. "There is a difference." Wyatt nodded. "There is." Without another word, he picked up his tools. The steady sound of hammering echoed across the valley for hours. Ethan followed close behind, carrying tiny nails inside his little pockets. Whenever Wyatt asked for one, Ethan proudly handed it over as though he were the foreman of the entire ranch. Abigail couldn't help smiling. "You've got yourself quite an assistant." Wyatt looked down. "He thinks he's doing all the work." "I am," Ethan declared proudly. His father laughed. "You're right." The boy puffed out his chest. "I fix ranch." "You certainly do." The sound of their laughter drifted across the fields. It had been years since Abigail had heard laughter carried by the wind instead of loneliness. By afternoon, the broken pasture gate stood straight again. The cattle wandered peacefully through fresh grass. Even the old windmill turned more smoothly than it had in months. Abigail carried cold water to Wyatt. He accepted the jar carefully. Their fingers brushed. Both remembered another summer. Another afternoon. Another life. She quietly broke the silence. "You said you've looked after Ethan alone since last winter." Wyatt stared at the distant hills. "Longer than that, in truth." She waited. He rarely spoke unless someone truly listened. When his mother became ill, she stayed in bed most days. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet sorrow. Ethan was barely walking. "I worked the ranch. I cooked. I rocked him to sleep. I prayed she would recover." Abigail lowered her eyes. "And when she didn't?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I promised her I'd never let him feel unwanted." Across the yard, Ethan chased a butterfly through the tall grass. His tiny laughter floated toward them. "There were nights," Wyatt admitted softly, "when all I could give him was the last piece of bread. But he never knew. He always thought I'd already eaten." Abigail looked at him with new understanding. She had spent years believing Wyatt had simply walked away from their future. Now she saw the man life had shaped. Not perfect, not untouched, but faithful, especially to the little boy running across her yard. Late that afternoon, a wagon rolled into the ranch. Dust followed behind its wheels. An older man climbed down carrying a sack of flour. His name was Walter Hayes, one of Abigail's closest neighbors. He greeted her warmly before noticing Wyatt repairing the barn roof. His smile faded. "I heard someone had come." Abigail nodded. "Wyatt's staying a while." Walter's expression became unreadable. "I remember him." "So do I." He lowered his voice. Folks in Pine Crossing remember how suddenly he disappeared. Abigail answered calmly. People remember stories. They don't always remember the truth. Walter looked surprised by her answer. I only came to warn you. About what? The bank. He glanced toward the ranch house. Mr. Hawthorne is riding through the valley next week. Abigail felt her stomach tighten. The name alone was enough. Edgar Hawthorne owned the mortgage on her ranch. He had already delayed payment twice after her husband's death. There would not be a third chance. If the money isn't ready, Walter continued gently, he'll take the property before winter. Wyatt climbed down from the roof, just in time to hear the last sentence. How much? Abigail looked uncomfortable. It isn't your concern. It is if I'm living under this roof. She hesitated. Finally, she answered. $400. Wyatt fell silent. It was more money than most ranch hands earned in an entire year. Walter sighed. I wish I had better news. After he left, the ranch seemed strangely quiet. Only the wind moved through the dry grass. Ethan wandered over holding a smooth white feather. Look, Papa. Wyatt forced a smile. That's a fine one. The child handed it to Abigail instead. For you. She accepted it carefully. Thank you. It's lucky. She smiled. I hope you're right. That evening's supper was quieter than the night before. Everyone sensed the weight hanging over the table. After Ethan fell asleep beside the fireplace with his favorite wooden horse tucked beneath one arm, Wyatt stepped onto the porch. Abigail joined him carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. The stars filled the Montana sky. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Wyatt broke the silence. Why didn't you tell me about the bank? I didn't invite you here to solve my problems. No. You invited me because a father and his little boy needed somewhere safe. She looked toward the dark fields. I couldn't close the door. Wyatt studied her face. You've always had the kindest heart of anyone I've known. She smiled sadly. It hasn't always made life easier. No, but it makes life better. She looked at him. For the first time since his return, neither looked away. There was still hurt between them. Still unanswered questions. Still 13 years of lost time. Yet beneath all of it was something quietly growing again. Not the careless love of youth. Something steadier. Built from sorrow, patience, and second chances. Just then Ethan appeared in the doorway, still half asleep. He carried his blanket behind him. I had bad dream. Wyatt knelt immediately. What happened? I couldn't find you. Without hesitation, Wyatt lifted him into his arms. I'm here. I'll always come when you call. Ethan rested his head against his father's shoulder and quickly drifted back to sleep. Abigail watched from the porch. A father who kept every promise to his son could not be the same man she had believed abandoned her all those years ago. Someone or something had stolen the truth before it ever reached her. If you've ever believed that one misunderstanding can change a lifetime, let us know in the comments. Sometimes the hardest roads begin with words that were never allowed to arrive. Inside the cabin, as Abigail prepared to put away a stack of old account books, one brittle envelope slipped from the back of a forgotten drawer. Across the faded paper, she recognized Wyatt's handwriting at once. The letter had never been opened, and it was dated 13 years earlier. Abigail stood motionless. The old envelope rested in her trembling hands, as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were worn. Across the front, written in neat, careful handwriting, were only a few words. Miss Abigail Turner, Her heart began to pound. She knew those letters. She had traced that handwriting in her dreams for years. Slowly, she looked toward the date in the corner. It was 13 years old. Her fingers shook so badly she almost dropped it. Wyatt. Her voice barely escaped her lips. Outside, Wyatt was finishing the last repairs on the barn door when he heard her call. Something in her voice made him hurry. He stepped into the cabin. Abigail turned toward him, tears already shining in her eyes. Without speaking, she held out the envelope. Wyatt stared at it. The color drained from his face. I wrote that. I know. It came back. She slowly shook her head. It never left. The room became perfectly still. Even the fire in the stove seemed quieter. Wyatt carefully accepted the letter. The seal had never been broken. His thumb rested over the faded wax. I sent 6 letters. Abigail whispered, "This is the first one I've ever seen." Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. The truth had arrived all by itself. Abigail unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had faded, but remained clear enough to read. Abby, my father has taken ill and I must ride north with my family. I have not forgotten my promise. Every mile away from you feels wrong, but I will return as soon as I can. Please wait for me. You're the only home I've ever wanted. Always, Wyatt. Abigail covered her mouth. Every lonely winter. Every sleepless night. Every tear she had cried believing he had chosen someone else. All of it rested inside one unopened letter. Wyatt closed his eyes. I never stopped writing. She looked at him. I never stopped waiting. A painful silence filled the cabin. Neither could recover the years they had lost. But now they finally knew they had been stolen. Late that afternoon, Abigail climbed the narrow staircase into the attic. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Old trunks lined the walls. Most of them had belonged to her late uncle, Franklin Turner, the man who had managed the ranch after her parents died. He had never trusted Wyatt. He had called him a dreamer with empty pockets. At the time, she believed he was simply being protective. Now she wasn't so certain. She searched through faded account books and broken tools until she reached an old cedar chest. Inside were bundles of tied papers. Tax records, receipts, land deeds. Then something caught her eye. A small leather pouch. She untied the string. 5 more unopened letters slid into her lap. All addressed to her. All written by Wyatt. For a moment she could not breathe. No. She whispered the word into the empty attic. One by one she opened them. Each letter told the same story. He missed her. He planned to return. He dreamed of building a ranch together. He never stopped believing she would read his words. By the final letter, the writing had changed. The hope was fading. If you've chosen another life, I'll accept it. I only pray you're happy. Abigail wiped away tears she could no longer hide. He believed I left him. She pressed the letters against her chest. And I believed exactly the same. That evening, the sky darkened with heavy clouds. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while Ethan sat on the floor carving shapes into a piece of pine, with a dull wooden toy knife Wyatt had made for him. Abigail joined them carrying the bundle of letters. She placed them gently on the table. I found the rest. Wyatt stared. For several seconds he couldn't speak. I don't understand. My uncle kept them. He handled every piece of mail after my father died. He must have hidden them before I ever saw them. Wyatt slowly lowered himself into a chair. His shoulders seemed heavier than before. I hated you for so many years. Abigail nodded sadly. So did I. Neither accusation carried anger anymore. Only sorrow. Ethan looked between them with innocent confusion. Why sad? Wyatt smiled gently. We lost something a long time ago. The little boy thought carefully. Then he climbed onto Abigail's lap. Without saying a word, he wrapped his tiny arms around her neck. She laughed softly through her tears. I think he's trying to fix us. Wyatt smiled. He's always believed hugs solve everything. They help. They do. For the first time since Wyatt arrived, the sadness inside the room lifted, if only a little. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 riders stopped outside the ranch. Leading them was Edgar Hawthorne, the banker who held Abigail's mortgage. He wore a black coat despite the warm weather. Everything about him looked clean and expensive. His boots had never known ranch work. He climbed down from his horse and removed his gloves. Mrs. Turner. Abigail stepped onto the porch. Mr. Hawthorne, I've come regarding your payment. She nodded quietly. I know. He looked around the ranch. His eyes paused on the repaired windmill. The rebuilt fence. The cattle grazing peacefully. Then they settled on Wyatt. I see you've hired help. He's staying here. For now. The banker gave Wyatt a long, measuring look. I hope you understand the ranch legally belongs to me if payment isn't made before the deadline. Wyatt remained calm. We understand. Edgar smiled politely. I'd hate to see a respectable woman lose everything. His words sounded kind. His eyes did not. After he rode away, Wyatt stood watching the disappearing dust. He wants this land. Abigail folded her arms. It borders the new rail survey. You know, I've heard the rumors. Wyatt looked toward the hills. He isn't just collecting a debt. He's waiting for you to fail. Before Abigail could answer, another rider appeared. This time it was Walter Hayes. He rode fast. Too fast. His horse was lathered with sweat. He barely stopped before jumping down. Wyatt. What happened? Walter caught his breath. I was in Pine Crossing. He looked nervously toward the road. I overheard 2 men talking inside the freight office. What about? They said someone paid your uncle years ago. Abigail froze. Walter continued. I couldn't hear every word. But I clearly heard one name. Franklin Turner. Wyatt looked at Abigail. What else? Walter lowered his voice. They also mentioned the banker. The same Edgar Hawthorne who wants this ranch. Silence settled over the yard. A cold feeling crept through Abigail. Her uncle had been dead for almost 4 years. If Walter was right, someone else had known the truth all along. And someone had profited from 13 years of lies. Wyatt looked toward the distant road where the banker had disappeared. This wasn't only about keeping us apart. Abigail slowly nodded. It may have been about this land from the very beginning. The evening shadows stretched across the valley. Inside the cabin, Abigail carefully placed all 6 letters inside her family Bible for safekeeping. She closed the cover gently. No more secrets, she whispered. Wyatt stood beside her. No more running. She looked into his eyes. For the first time in 13 years, neither of them saw strangers. They saw the future that had almost been stolen forever. If this chapter of their journey moved you, don't forget to like the story and share your thoughts below. Tell us honestly, would you fight to uncover the truth, no matter how many years had passed? Neither of them noticed the lone rider watching the ranch from the top of the western ridge. As darkness covered Bitter Elk Valley, the stranger turned his horse and rode hard toward town, carrying news that would place Wyatt, Abigail, and little Ethan in greater danger before the week was over. The following morning arrived wrapped in silence. A pale fog rested across Bitter Elk Valley while the first rays of sunlight touched the hills. From the porch, Abigail watched Wyatt repairing a wagon wheel. Ethan sat beside him, carefully arranging smooth stones into neat little rows as though building a tiny ranch of his own. For the first time in years, the old homestead felt alive. Then the peace was broken. The sound of horses echoed across the yard. 3 riders approached through the morning mist. At their front rode Sheriff Owen Barrett. Behind him came Walter Hayes and another elderly man dressed in a faded black suit. His white beard reached the middle of his chest, and under one arm he carried a worn leather satchel. Abigail recognized him immediately. Mr. Ellis. Jonathan Ellis had served as the valley's postmaster years before retiring to live with his daughter near Missoula. Few people had seen him since. The old man removed his hat. I wish this were only a friendly visit. Sheriff Barrett looked toward Wyatt. We've uncovered something you both deserve to hear. Everyone gathered inside the cabin. The old postmaster slowly opened his satchel. Inside rested a weathered ledger. He carefully turned several fragile pages before stopping. I kept copies of every mail complaint brought to my office. His finger rested beside an entry dated 13 years earlier. I remember your letters, Wyatt. Wyatt leaned closer. You do? Mr. Ellis nodded. You came to my office nearly every week asking whether Miss Abigail had written back. I did. You also asked why so many of your letters were being returned. Wyatt's voice became quiet. I never received an answer. The old man's eyes filled with regret. I believed it was a simple delivery mistake. He sighed deeply. But after hearing Walter's story, I searched my old records. He slid another paper across the table. It carried Franklin Turner's signature. Beside it was a request that all family correspondence addressed to Abigail Turner be delivered directly to him while he managed the ranch during her father's illness. Abigail stared at the paper. My uncle. Mr. Ellis nodded sadly. He collected every letter before you ever had the chance to see it. Sheriff Barrett folded his arms. There's more. Walter stepped forward. I spoke with an old bookkeeper from Pine Crossing. He remembered Edgar Hawthorne lending Franklin Turner money shortly before those letters disappeared. Abigail's stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means, the sheriff answered calmly, your uncle was drowning in debt. Hawthorne wanted the Turner Ranch because the railway survey suggested the land would soon become valuable. Wyatt looked toward Abigail. They believed if we married. The ranch would stay in our family, Abigail finished quietly. Walter nodded. So they separated you before that could happen. The room fell silent. 13 years. 13 years of grief had been traded for land and money. No one spoke. Even Ethan seemed to sense the sadness surrounding the adults. He quietly walked across the room and slipped his tiny hand into Abigail's. She squeezed it gently. The child reminded her that life still moved forward. Not every story had to end where it broke. 2 days later, Sheriff Barrett returned with official papers. Edgar Hawthorne had been questioned. Faced with the postmaster's records and his former bookkeeper's testimony, he admitted that Franklin Turner had accepted money to keep Wyatt's letters hidden. Franklin had believed Wyatt was too poor to give Abigail a secure future. Hawthorne simply saw an opportunity to gain control of valuable land. Franklin had died years earlier. Justice could never reach him. But Hawthorne's claim against the ranch was declared invalid after investigators uncovered fraudulent changes in the mortgage records. The debt was reduced to a fair amount Abigail could realistically repay over time. When the sheriff handed her the corrected papers, tears filled her eyes. "I thought I'd lose everything." Sheriff Barrett smiled. "Sometimes the truth arrives late. But it still arrives." Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The first snow dusted the valley. Wyatt repaired the porch roof before winter fully arrived. He rebuilt the smokehouse. He strengthened the barn doors against the bitter Montana winds. Every evening Ethan waited by the gate until Wyatt finished working. The little boy refused to go inside until his father walked beside him. One afternoon Abigail found Wyatt carving a small rocking horse from a block of pine. "You made that?" He smiled. "My father carved one for me." She gently ran her fingers across the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. I figured every ranch should have at least one toy." Ethan spotted it before Wyatt finished. His eyes grew wide. "For me." Wyatt laughed. "Who else?" The little boy hugged the wooden horse so tightly everyone laughed. That evening Ethan carried it to bed. He refused to sleep without it beside his pillow. Winter settled over Bitter Elk Valley. Snow covered the fences. Smoke rose peacefully from the chimney. Inside the cabin, warmth replaced loneliness. Abigail baked fresh bread while Ethan proudly helped knead the dough, leaving flour across his nose. Wyatt looked at them from the doorway. The picture before him stole his breath. Months earlier, he had believed his life was over. Now laughter filled the very home he once thought he had lost forever. Abigail noticed him watching. "What?" "I was trying to remember the last time this house sounded so happy." She smiled. "I don't think it ever has." That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep beside the fireplace with his little rocking horse tucked beneath one arm, Wyatt stepped outside. Snowflakes drifted gently beneath the moonlight. A few moments later, Abigail joined him, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders. Neither hurried to speak. Finally, Wyatt reached into his coat pocket. He removed something wrapped in a clean handkerchief. Inside rested a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone. "It isn't fancy." Abigail looked at him with surprised eyes. "It doesn't need to be." He took a slow breath. "I cannot give back the 13 years we lost. I cannot erase the pain. I cannot change the roads we were forced to walk." He looked toward the warm cabin where Ethan slept peacefully. "But if you'll allow me, I'd like to spend every year we have left making different memories." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "You once promised to build me a home." "I remember." She smiled softly. "You already have." Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She laughed through happy tears. "This time," she whispered, "don't leave." He gently rested his forehead against hers. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I never will." Spring returned to Bitter Elk Valley with green fields and flowing streams. Neighbors gathered at the ranch for a simple wedding beneath a towering cottonwood tree. Walter stood proudly beside Wyatt. Sarah Hayes helped Abigail fasten a small bouquet of wildflowers. Sheriff Barrett attended with his wife. Even old Mr. Ellis made the long journey to witness the ceremony that should have happened many years earlier. When the vows were finished, applause echoed across the valley. Ethan tugged gently on Abigail's dress. She knelt beside him. The little boy wrapped both arms around her neck. "Can I call you Mama now?" Her tears came before her answer. "You've never needed permission." He smiled the biggest smile anyone had ever seen. "Mama." The single word filled every empty corner of the ranch. Wyatt quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Years passed. The ranch flourished once again. The repaired windmill turned steadily through every season. Children's laughter echoed across the yard as Ethan grew into a kind and dependable young man who loved the land as much as his parents did. Near the front door, Abigail placed 6 faded letters inside a small wooden box. Beside them, she kept Wyatt's first silver ring and one smooth white feather Ethan had given her on his second day at the ranch. Whenever visitors asked why those ordinary things were so precious, she simply smiled. They remind us that truth may be delayed, but love is worth waiting for. On quiet evenings, Wyatt and Abigail often sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and crimson. Neither spoke much. They no longer needed to. The silence between them had changed. Once it had been filled with unanswered questions. Now it was filled with peace. If this story reminded you that forgiveness can open doors pride never could, thank you for staying until the very end. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe some people are meant to find each other, no matter how many years stand between them? As the windmill turned gently above the peaceful ranch, Wyatt reached for Abigail's hand. Ethan laughed somewhere beyond the barn, and the home that had nearly been lost forever stood stronger than ever, built not only from timber and stone, but from truth, courage, and a second chance that neither of them would ever let